In this gripping story of betrayal and heartbreak, a husband uncovers his wife's secret affair, unraveling a web of lies that shakes the foundation of their marriage. As tensions escalate, confrontations with the wife and her lover bring hidden truths to light, leaving him torn between revenge and closure. Meanwhile, an unexpected ally emerges, complicating the emotional turmoil and raising the stakes. Will he find a way to reclaim his sense of self, or will the betrayal leave irreversible scars? Dive into this intense journey through love, trust, and revenge to see how it all unfolds. Don't miss the shocking twists. The story begins in the fall of 2015, in the small town of Willow Creek. Known for its picturesque streets and close-knit community, Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. At the heart of this quiet town lived Daniel and Claire Harper, a couple in their early 30s who seemed to have it all: a charming home, successful careers, and a love story straight out of a romance novel. Daniel, a middle school teacher, was the kind of man people trusted instantly. His easygoing demeanor and quick wit made him popular among students and colleagues alike. He had a passion for history and often found himself lost in books, imagining what it would have been like to live in different eras. Claire, on the other hand, was a driven graphic designer who freelanced for major companies while maintaining an impeccable balance between work and family. Her creativity and warmth drew people in, and her laugh was said to light up a room. To outsiders, the Harpers were the perfect couple. They had been together since college, their relationship built on years of shared dreams and mutual support. But behind the closed doors of their home, cracks were beginning to form in the foundation of their seemingly perfect life. It all started subtly, in ways that neither of them fully noticed. Daniel had begun to spend longer hours at school, volunteering for extracurricular activities and tutoring sessions. Claire, meanwhile, was buried under a mountain of deadlines, often working late into the night. Their conversations became brief, mostly revolving around schedules and grocery lists. The intimacy they once shared, those little moments of stolen laughter and late-night confessions, was fading, replaced by a quiet distance that neither acknowledged. Claire's best friend, Sophie, had been the first to point it out over coffee one afternoon. She tilted her head and asked, "Is everything okay with you and Daniel? You've seemed distracted lately." Claire had waved her off with a laugh, insisting everything was fine. But the question lingered, creeping into her thoughts during her quiet moments. Daniel too felt the shift but couldn't quite put his finger on it. He chalked it up to the pressures of work and the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. Yet, there were times he'd catch himself staring at old photos of them, pictures from their college days, when life felt simpler, and wonder if they were slowly losing what made them special. Then came the night that changed everything. Claire had been working on a major project for weeks. Her client, a demanding tech company, had thrown last-minute revisions her way, and she was racing to meet the deadline. That evening, Daniel had come home late from a school event, his shirt slightly wrinkled and his tie askew. Claire barely looked up from her laptop as he walked through the door. "Long day?" she asked, her voice distracted. "Yeah," he replied, loosening his tie. "We had the fundraiser tonight. It went pretty well." "That's good," she murmured, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The conversation ended there. As the weeks went on, Daniel's late nights became more frequent. He explained it away with meetings, parent conferences, and after-school activities. Claire didn't question him. She trusted him completely. But something began to gnaw at the edges of her mind. A tiny, insistent voice she tried to ignore. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, Claire noticed a notification light blinking on Daniel's phone, which he had left on the counter. She glanced at the screen, intending to call him over, but froze when she saw the name. Emily. Emily was a colleague of Daniel's, someone Claire had met briefly at a school event. She remembered thinking Emily was friendly and outgoing, with a bright smile that seemed to put everyone at ease. But why was she texting Daniel at this hour? The message was innocent enough. "Thanks for staying late tonight, I really appreciated your help." Claire shrugged it off, convincing herself it was work-related, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Claire found herself noticing things she hadn't. Before, Daniel was more protective of his phone, often keeping it in his pocket or face down on the table. He seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere even when they were together. And then there were the little white lies. The times he'd say he was at school, but came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. Claire tried to push the thoughts away, to tell herself she was being paranoid. But one evening, while Daniel was in the shower, she found herself reaching for his phone again. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through his messages, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and guilt. Most of the texts between Daniel and Emily were innocent, discussions about work and casual banter. But then she saw it, a string of messages that made her stomach drop. Emily. "Last night was amazing. I haven't felt this way in years." Daniel. "Me neither. I can't stop thinking about you." Claire's world tilted. She read the messages over and over, hoping she was misunderstanding, but the words were clear. Her husband was having an affair. She put the phone down, her mind racing. A million questions flooded her thoughts. How long had this been going on? Why was it her fault? Had she been too distant, too focused on work? But beneath the whirlwind of emotions, one feeling rose above all others. Betrayal. That night, Claire didn't confront Daniel. She couldn't. Instead, she lay awake beside him, her mind replaying the messages and analyzing every moment they had shared in the past few months. The next morning, she called Sophie. When Sophie arrived at Claire's house, she took one look at her friend's tear-streaked face and pulled her into a hug. "What happened?" she asked gently. Claire hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "I think Daniel's cheating on me," she finally whispered. Sophie's eyes widened. "What are you sure?" Claire nodded, recounting what she had seen. Sophie listened intently, her expression shifting from shock to anger. "You need to confront him," she said firmly. "You deserve answers." But Claire wasn't ready. Not yet. She needed time to process, to figure out what to do. She began paying closer attention to Daniel, watching for signs that might confirm her suspicions. And as she observed him, her heart broke a little more each day. Claire started piecing together a timeline, using the texts she had seen and the details Daniel had shared about his late nights. It became clear that the affair had been going on for months, hidden in plain sight. The realization left her feeling hollow. This was the man she had built her life with, the person she had trusted more than anyone, and he had betrayed her in the worst way possible. As the days turned into weeks, Claire found herself consumed by the weight of what she had discovered. Every glance at Daniel felt like a knife twisting in her chest. How could he sit across from her at dinner, cracking jokes about work, while carrying on a secret life with someone else? The duality of it all was unbearable. Yet Claire hesitated to confront him, unsure of what she wanted. The truth, revenge, or perhaps a way to fix what was broken. One evening, as Daniel worked late again, Claire decided to take matters into her own hands. She called Sophie, her steadfast confidant, and asked for help. "Meet me at the coffee shop," Claire said. Her voice was steady, but Sophie could sense the storm brewing beneath. Over steaming cups of coffee, Claire laid out her plan. She needed proof. The texts were damning, but she wanted more, something undeniable that Daniel couldn't explain away. Sophie, though hesitant, eventually agreed to help. "I don't love the idea of spying, but you deserve answers," Sophie said, her voice firm. "Let's get to the bottom of this." The following week, Claire borrowed Sophie's car and parked near the school one evening. She watched from a distance as Daniel left the building. Her heart raced when she saw Emily waiting for him in the parking lot. The two exchanged a quick glance, then walked to Daniel's car, their movements casual but loaded with a familiarity that stung Claire like a slap. Claire snapped a few photos with her phone, her hands trembling. She hated herself for doing this, for becoming the kind of person who spied on her husband. But she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. It was there, unfolding before her eyes. At home, Claire reviewed the photos, the evidence stark against the backdrop of her love for Daniel. She knew she had to confront him, but how should she wait for the perfect moment, or confront him as soon as he walked through the door? She opted for the latter. When Daniel came home, his tie loosened and his face tired, Claire was waiting in the living room. The photos sat on the coffee table between them, like a loaded gun. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel froze, his eyes darting to the photos, his face drained of color, and for a moment, he seemed to consider denying it. But the evidence was there, undeniable. "Claire," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "How long?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How long have you been lying to me?" Daniel sighed and sat down, his hands rubbing his temples. "A few months," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Claire laughed bitterly, a sound that carried no humor. "Didn't mean for it to go this far. You've been sneaking around for months, Daniel. This wasn't an accident." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with something Claire couldn't quite place. Guilt, regret, or was it simply fear of getting caught? "I never stopped loving you," he said. "It's just, things haven't been the same between us." Claire's anger flared. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to find comfort in someone else. Do you even understand what you've done to me, to us?" Over the next few days, the house became a battlefield. Every conversation turned into an argument. Every interaction laced with tension. Daniel insisted he wanted to make things right. But Claire wasn't sure she could ever trust him again. How could she rebuild a life with someone who had betrayed her so completely? Sophie remained a constant presence, her unwavering support, the only thing keeping Claire from falling apart. "You need to decide what you want," Sophie said one evening, as they sat in Claire's kitchen. "Do you want to try to fix this, or is it time to move on?" "I don't know," Claire admitted. "Part of me wants to fight for what we had, but another part of me, I don't think I can forgive him." The turning point came one rainy afternoon. Claire had taken the day off work, her mind too scattered to focus on anything productive. She was scrolling through social media when she saw a post from Emily, a photo of her and Daniel, smiling together at what looked like a staff outing. The caption read, "The best things happen when you least expect them." Claire's stomach churned. It wasn't just the photo, it was the audacity of it all. Emily didn't even bother to hide what she was doing. That was the moment Claire knew she couldn't live like this anymore. When Daniel came home that evening, Claire was ready. She handed him a packed suitcase and said, "You need to leave." Daniel's eyes widened. "Claire, please, let's talk about this." "There's nothing left to talk about," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." As the door closed behind him, Claire felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. She had stood up for herself, but the cost was immense. The life she had built with Daniel was gone, and she was left to pick up the pieces. Sophie came over later that evening, armed with wine and an endless supply of encouragement. "You did the right thing," she said. "It's going to hurt for a while, but you're stronger than you think." Claire nodded, unsure if she believed it. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. A sense that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way through the pain. Claire's journey wasn't easy. The weeks that followed were filled with moments of doubt and sadness, but also with small victories. She started going to therapy, rediscovering the parts of herself she had lost in her marriage. She reconnected with old friends, threw herself into her work, and even started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned years ago. Meanwhile, Daniel made several attempts to win her back. He sent flowers, left heartfelt notes, and even showed up at her office once, begging for a second chance. But Claire stood firm. She knew that forgiveness might come in time, but trust was a different story. For those watching, remember, life's twists and turns may break us, but they also teach us our worth. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to join us for more stories that remind us of the strength within us all. The days after Daniel left were a blur of silence. Claire had hoped that the space would bring clarity, that the ache in her chest would lessen, but it only deepened. She had expected the loneliness, but she hadn't prepared for the waves of anger that kept coming at her in fits and starts. Anger at Daniel, at Emily, at herself for staying in a relationship that had been suffocating her for so long. But through all of this, Claire found herself growing. It wasn't an easy transformation. No, it was more like a slow burn. Therapy helped, sure, but it was the little things that brought her peace. Sitting outside on her porch at dawn with a cup of coffee, taking long walks through the park, rediscovering her love for painting. Little by little, she started to piece herself back together. Sophie remained her anchor. She had listened to Claire vent endlessly about her pain, her fear, and the overwhelming weight of the situation. Sophie, ever the realist, didn't sugarcoat anything, but she was always there, ready with a listening ear or a sarcastic quip to lighten the mood. "I'm telling you, Claire," Sophie said one evening after Claire had spilled another round of frustrations about Daniel's repeated attempts to reach out. "This man is like a bad penny. He just keeps showing up." Claire chuckled bitterly. "I know, right? It's like he thinks his guilt is some sort of magic spell that'll make me forget everything." Sophie leaned back in her chair, taking a sip of her wine. "I think he's hoping you'll cave that he can pull the 'I'm sorry' card enough times to get you back." "Maybe he's right," Claire muttered, feeling her resolve crack for a moment. "Maybe I should forgive him." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Forgiving him is fine, if you want to do that, but you have to forgive yourself first. Don't let him weasel his way back in because you feel bad. Own your power here." But as much as Claire had tried to distance herself from the past wasn't done with her. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after Daniel left, Claire received an unexpected letter. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. No texts, no flowers, no calls, and the silence was almost comforting. But this letter, this tangible thing in her hands, broke the stillness. Claire's fingers trembled as she broke the seal, her eyes scanning over the neatly written words that somehow felt like a betrayal all over again. "Claire, I can't stop thinking about you. I know I've hurt you beyond words, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that none of this was ever about you. It was me. I was broken, and in my own mess, I did something unforgivable. I'm not asking for another chance. I'm just asking that you don't hate me forever." It was simple, direct, and it hit Claire harder than anything he'd said before. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic plea. It was raw, the kind of honesty Claire had craved but never got. The words echoed in her mind. None of this was ever about you. And then, there it was, the moment that would change everything. The following weekend, Claire took the day off. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the letter. Maybe it was the restlessness that had been slowly building up inside of her. She needed to clear her head, to make sense of the mess that had been her life over the past several months. It was a rainy afternoon when she decided to visit the small cafe where she and Daniel had once gone on Sunday mornings. The place still smelled of fresh pastries and strong coffee, just like it had years ago. It was a spot they used to love, a quiet refuge from the world. When she walked inside, she didn't expect to see him. Daniel sat in the corner booth, looking just as out of place as she felt. His eyes met hers before he could hide the shock. He didn't speak at first, didn't even move, but Claire felt it. That electric tension between them, a connection that had never really gone away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was heavy, full of unsaid things. Then, Daniel stood up, his face tight with emotion. "Claire," he said softly, almost pleading, "I didn't expect you to show up." Claire just nodded. She wasn't sure why she was there. Wasn't sure if she wanted closure, revenge, or just to see the man she'd loved for so long. She wanted answers. She wanted honesty. But what she got, at first, was nothing but the familiar ache in her chest. They sat across from each other, a sea of silence between them. The weight of the past hung in the air, but Claire refused to let it swallow her whole again. "Why, Daniel?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it? Was I not enough for you? Was our marriage so bad that you needed her?" Daniel opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. For a moment, Claire saw him, the man she used to know, the one who had loved her with such devotion in the beginning. It was all still there beneath the hurt, beneath the guilt. "I don't have an excuse," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Claire. I never meant to hurt you. But I've always been broken, always chasing something I could never find. And in the process, I lost the only person who ever truly loved me." Claire's breath hitched as he spoke, the rawness in his voice cutting deeper than she expected. There was no denying the truth in his words, but it didn't change anything. "I don't want to hate you, Daniel," Claire said, her voice trembling as she fought back the tears. "I just don't know how to look at you the same way anymore." The confrontation wasn't the catharsis Claire had imagined. There were no tears, no dramatic confessions. It was simply two people coming face to face with the wreckage of what they had once built, knowing that the foundation was gone. Whatever had been between them was no longer there, and no amount of words could fix that. But in that moment, Claire knew something. She had to let go of the past, of the betrayal, and of the idea that she could ever return to the person she used to be with him. And so, after one last, lingering glance, Claire stood up. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Daniel," she said softly, walking out of the cafe, her heart heavy but resolute. As the days passed, the memories of Daniel faded. The pain didn't go away completely, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. Claire knew that healing would take time, but for the first time in months, she felt free. Free from the weight of someone else's mistakes, and free from the toxic love she had once thought was everything. In the weeks that followed, Sophie stood by Claire's side, always ready with a joke, a listening ear, or a shoulder to lean on. Slowly, Claire started to rebuild her life. She focused on her art, began new projects at work, and even started dating again. Though she kept her heart guarded, knowing that she wasn't quite ready to open it fully yet, but she was learning. She was learning to love herself again, to trust her instincts, and to remember that in the end, she was enough, whether or not someone else saw it. And as the final months of the year passed, Claire found peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from closure, but the kind that comes from within. After her encounter with Daniel at the cafe, Claire was left in a daze. The conversation had been brief, but it lingered in her thoughts like a heavy fog. She had expected more emotions, more answers. But what she got instead was a quiet finality that settled deeper than any confession could. In the days that followed, a part of her felt like she'd closed the door on that chapter. But another part kept pulling her back to the what-ifs and the lingering doubts. Was that the right choice? Could they have worked things out? These questions haunted her for days, but Claire knew she had to push them aside, to focus on herself again. After all, she had spent so long lost in the chaos of her relationship with Daniel that she'd almost forgotten who she was before him. Then, just as Claire was starting to regain some semblance of control, she received a call that would turn everything upside down once more. It was late on a Friday evening, and she was at home, curled up on her couch with a book, when her phone rang. The name on the screen made her stomach drop. Emily. Her heart skipped a beat, but Claire quickly shook off the panic she hadn't heard from Emily since the fallout. And while the two had never been the closest of friends, Claire had always known she was the other woman in Daniel's life. Emily had tried to apologize, tried to explain, but Claire wasn't interested in hearing it. It was too late for apologies. Too late for anything. "Hello?" Claire answered cautiously, her voice tight. "Claire, we need to talk." Emily's voice came through, sounding more frantic than Claire had ever heard it. Claire's grip on the phone tightened. "About what?" "About Daniel," Emily said, her voice trembling. It's urgent. Please, just hear me out." Claire hesitated for a moment, considering hanging up, but something in Emily's voice stopped her. Maybe it was the desperation, or maybe it was the feeling that something was about to change. "What is it?" Claire asked, her voice hard but laced with curiosity. There was a long pause before Emily finally spoke again. I think Daniel's in trouble. He's been missing for a few days now. I don't know where he is and I can't get a hold of him. I'm really scared, Claire." Emily's voice cracked as she said the last part, and for a brief second, Claire could hear the rawness of the fear behind it. The words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. She had always imagined that Daniel would fade into the background of her life, eventually becoming a distant memory. But the possibility that something had happened to him, that was different. She wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her was angry that Emily was even calling her about this. The other part, however, couldn't ignore the humanity in Emily's voice. "I don't know if I should believe you," Claire said slowly, her voice uncertain. "After everything that's happened, why should I trust anything you say?" "I understand," Emily replied, her voice full of guilt. "But please, Claire. This is serious. I think something's gone wrong, and I don't know what to do." There was another pause, and for the first time since their conversation had started, Claire found herself thinking beyond her hurt and resentment. She had hated Daniel for what he did to her. But this wasn't about them anymore. This was about him, about a person who had once been a part of her life. "Okay," Claire finally said, her voice tight but calm. "I'll help you. But you're going to have to tell me everything." The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Claire and Emily spent hours trying to track down Daniel. Emily had reached out to his friends, his family, and even his co-workers, but no one had heard from him. He hadn't been answering his phone, and he hadn't shown up for work in days. Claire didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then, on Sunday afternoon, Claire received the call. It was from the police. "Is this Claire Matthews?" the officer on the other end asked, his voice neutral. "Yes," Claire replied, her pulse quickening. "We found Daniel," the officer said. "He's been in an accident. He's in critical condition. We need you to come down to the hospital immediately." Claire's stomach twisted into knots. She didn't know what to feel, relief that they had found him, or dread at the thought of what she might find when she got there. By the time Claire arrived at the hospital, Emily was already there, sitting in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn. She stood up when Claire walked in, and for the first time since their tense interactions, they shared a brief, silent moment of solidarity. "How is he?" Claire asked, her voice almost a whisper. "He's in surgery," Emily said, her voice shaky. "They won't tell me much, but it doesn't look good." Claire nodded, not knowing what to say. All the anger she'd been holding onto seemed so small in comparison to what was happening now. She had no idea what had happened to Daniel, but she was here for better or worse. She was here. The hours stretched on Claire, and Emily sat together, exchanging quiet words when necessary, but mostly sitting in silence, waiting for news that seemed to never come. Finally, a doctor came in. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes, his expression somber. "Are you family?" he asked, looking at both women. "I'm his ex-wife," Claire said quietly. "She's a friend." The doctor nodded. "I'm afraid the situation is critical. He's suffered multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and some head trauma. We're doing everything we can, but I'm not sure how he's going to pull through." The words hit Claire like a wave of cold water. She could barely process them, could barely breathe. Daniel was fighting for his life, and despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal, the heartbreak, there was a part of Claire that couldn't help but feel responsible. She had left him. She had walked away. And now he was here, in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, guilt, fear, confusion, but the one thought that lingered above them all was simple. What if I'm too late? The next few days were a blur. Claire stayed at the hospital, trying to make sense of everything. Emily was there too, but her presence only seemed to heighten the tension. Claire didn't know what was real anymore. Was she helping Daniel because she wanted to? Or was it because she felt obligated? She didn't even know what she felt about him anymore. All she knew was that she couldn't walk away again. Not now. Not when everything was hanging in the balance. Every day, they received updates from the doctors, some better than others. Daniel was still alive, but the situation was tenuous. Claire visited him in the ICU, watching him from the doorway for a long time, unable to bring herself to get too close. It was strange to see him like this. Vulnerable, broken. It made all the anger she had felt seem so distant, so insignificant. And then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Daniel woke up. Daniel's awakening was nothing short of a shock to Claire. After days of uncertainty and mounting fear, the sound of his voice was like a faint, distant echo she hadn't expected to hear again. She had stood in his ICU room, her hand resting on the cold metal railing of his bed, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of the jumble of emotions inside her. The steady beep of his heart monitor had been the only sound in the room until, finally, his eyelids fluttered open. Claire hadn't known what to say. What could she say after everything that had happened between them? But her heart, against all reason, just wanted to reach out and hold him. She had loved him once, deeply. And now, here he was, fighting for his life. And she was still here, standing at his side, not sure what part of her was doing it. "Claire?" Daniel's voice was weak, hoarse, barely a whisper. He blinked at her, disoriented, like he was struggling to remember where he was, or who he was. "Hey," she replied, her voice trembling despite her best effort to keep it steady. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." But Daniel's gaze seemed distant. He was still caught in the fog of his injuries, unsure of the world around him. Claire felt the pressure of the silence between them, the weight of the unspoken words that lingered in the air. "What happened?" Daniel croaked. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the question they both had avoided for so long. Claire hesitated. This was the moment where everything could either fall apart or somehow start to piece itself together. She'd spent days wrestling with what she should do, whether it was better to let him wake up to the broken reality of their relationship or to keep the past buried. But the weight of it all was suffocating, and the truth, no matter how painful, seemed to hang in the balance. You were in a car accident," she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm. We didn't know where you were or what happened. You've been unconscious for a few days. Daniel's brow furrowed, trying to process the information. I don't remember. Claire's chest tightened. You were hurt badly, Daniel. You're lucky to be alive. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Claire's eyes wandered to the machines around him, the IVs and monitors that kept him tethered to this fragile reality. Her emotions swirled in 1,000 different directions. Relief, anger, guilt, confusion. She'd walked away from him, but now here he was, lying in front of her, fragile and vulnerable. What happened to us? Daniel whispered suddenly, his eyes locking with hers, searching for answers. Why? Why did you leave me, Claire? The question hung in the air like a weight that neither of them could shake off. There it was. The question she'd been running from. The question that had been buried under all the pain and resentment, and now it was finally out in the open, impossible to ignore. I didn't leave you, Claire said, the words coming out more forcefully than she intended. I couldn't stay you. You lied to me. You kept things from me, Daniel. I wasn't enough, and you just kept pulling away. The words stung as they left her mouth, each one a raw reminder of the betrayal she had felt. She wasn't sure if they were meant for him, or if they were just for her, a release of all the emotions she had stuffed down for so long. But once they were out, there was no taking them back. Daniel's eyes softened, guilt flashing across his face. I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best. For both of us. You don't get to decide what's best for me, Claire shot back, her voice trembling with the anger that had been building inside her. You think that's what you were doing? Hiding things from me? Lying, cheating? Was that really what was best for us? The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He winced, as if each accusation was a punch to the gut. His face twisted with regret, but it was too late for apologies now, too late for promises. I never meant for things to get so messed up, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I was just scared, and I didn't know how to make things right. Claire felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something close. A recognition of the vulnerability in his voice, the truth of the pain he was feeling. And yet, it wasn't enough to erase what had happened. It couldn't undo the years they had lost, the trust that had shattered beyond repair. I'm not sure we can fix this, Claire whispered, the words more to herself than to him. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. I don't know if we can go back. There was a long silence, one that stretched between them like an invisible chasm, the weight of the past still hanging heavily in the air. Daniel's eyes searched hers, as if pleading for something, anything to change. But Claire wasn't sure she had the strength to give him that. Before either of them could speak again, Emily entered the room, her face pale and tired, her eyes red from lack of sleep. The moment she saw Claire and Daniel, the atmosphere shifted instantly. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, like the calm before a storm. Claire, Emily said, her voice shaking, can we talk? Claire didn't know what to say. She didn't want to face Emily, not now, not with everything that was happening. But there was no avoiding it. There was no avoiding the reckoning that was coming. Of course, Claire said, standing up from her chair. She shot one last glance at Daniel, his eyes full of pain, before following Emily out into the hallway. They stood there in the quiet, the tension between them almost suffocating. Emily seemed to be holding herself together, but Claire could see the cracks. She could see the guilt and fear in her eyes. I know you probably hate me, Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper. But I swear, I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Claire felt a sharp, angry breath rise in her chest, but instead of lashing out, She took a deep breath and forced herself to listen. "I don't hate you," Claire said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "I hate what happened. I hate what we became. I hate the lies, the betrayal. But you're not the one who did this to me. He did." Emily's eyes welled up with tears, and Claire couldn't bring herself to look away. "Then why are you still here?" Emily asked softly, her voice breaking. "Why are you still trying to fix things with him?" For a moment, Claire didn't answer. The truth was, she wasn't sure herself. Was she trying to fix things? Or was she just trapped in the middle of something that felt bigger than all of them? "I don't know," Claire finally said. "I don't know what to do anymore." The hospital room felt colder now, the sterile white walls closing in, as Claire stared at Emily, struggling to keep her composure. It was as if the world outside had evaporated, leaving only the three of them, Daniel, Emily, and Claire, locked in this small, suffocating bubble. The weight of everything they had been through, everything they had lost, hung over them like a storm cloud. "I don't know what you expect me to say, Emily," Claire said, her voice hoarse, the anger from earlier still simmering under the surface, but now it was mixed with a deep sadness. "You think I'm going to forgive you just like that, after everything, after you and Daniel, after all the lies?" Emily flinched at the accusation, and Claire immediately regretted her harsh tone. But the wound was too fresh, too raw to hold back. "I never wanted to hurt you, Claire, I swear," Emily pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "You have to believe me. What happened between Daniel and me? It wasn't planned. It wasn't anything I expected. And when it all came out, I didn't know how to handle it. I was just so scared I thought you'd never forgive me." Claire's stomach twisted as Emily's voice cracked. She could see the pain in her eyes, the remorse that seemed genuine. But at the same time, it didn't change what had happened. She didn't know if forgiveness was something she could even begin to consider. How could she? After all of this. "You didn't handle it, Emily," Claire said, her voice tight, trying to hold herself together. "You kept it from me. You hid everything, and you watched me stand by you, thinking I was helping you, when all along you were sleeping with my husband." The words felt like daggers, but they were the truth, and it hurt. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Emily's body shook with quiet sobs, her shoulders hunched as if she were physically carrying the weight of all her guilt. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Emily finally whispered. "I don't deserve it, but I need you to understand that I never meant for any of this to happen." Claire closed her eyes, trying to push down the surge of emotions that threatened to overtake her. She wasn't sure what understanding meant at this point, or if she was even capable of finding it. But she had to admit, there was something in Emily's words, in her grief, that hit too close to home. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this," Claire said, her voice shaking now. She took a step back, her chest tightening as she tried to breathe through the tension. "I don't even know what I want anymore." "Claire," Emily said, her voice raw, I never meant to steal him from you. I swear I don't even know how it happened, but She choked on the words, her face contorting with regret. "I loved him. I didn't know what to do with it." That last sentence cut through Claire like a blade. Emily loved Daniel. The truth of it burned through her chest, leaving a searing ache in its wake. It wasn't just the affair. It was the knowledge that Emily had fallen in love with the one person Claire had believed was hers, was still hers. It was a betrayal beyond words. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again," Claire muttered, stepping back a little more. Her mind swirled, racing through every moment, every lie, every exchange between them. How long had it been going on? How long had they been deceiving her? Both of them. The pain of it was suffocating, too much to bear, and yet, beneath it all, something else stirred inside of her, a question, a hesitation, a recognition that everything they had, everything she had fallen apart, but could it ever be rebuilt? And if so, by whom? The next morning, things only became more complicated. Claire had hoped to have some peace, to think things through, but the arrival of Daniel's parents threw her into turmoil once again. They had always been polite, always pretended to like her, but now they stood in the doorway of his hospital room, both of them looking at her with expressions that could only be described as judgmental. Daniel's mother, a sharp woman with cold eyes, barely acknowledged Claire as she entered the room. She glanced briefly at her son, still asleep and hooked up to IVs, before turning back to Claire with an intensity that made Claire feel small. "How is he?" she asked, her tone clipped and controlled. "He's stable," Claire replied, doing her best to remain calm, despite the tension that hung in the air. "He's still unconscious, but the doctors say it's a good sign." The look Daniel's mother gave her was dismissive, and Claire fought the urge to snap back. The last thing she needed was to deal with them right now. Not when everything was falling apart. Not when her emotions were on the edge of spilling over. Daniel's father, a man of few words, nodded at Claire, his lips set in a hard line. It was clear to her that they didn't see her as part of the family anymore, not after everything that had happened. They never liked her to begin with, and now they were likely thinking the worst. She was the wife who had been betrayed, and in their eyes, it was probably her fault. In some strange way, they were all blaming her. She had no idea what they thought. She wasn't even sure if she cared anymore. Not after Emily. Not after Daniel. She stood there, silent and unblinking, trying to keep her emotions in check. The last thing she wanted was another confrontation, but it was coming. She could feel it. The air was thick with the unspoken, and it would only be a matter of time before everything came to a head. Hours later, as the day turned to evening, Claire's patience finally snapped. Daniel had woken up briefly, his eyes glazed with confusion, and she had tried to comfort him, even though she didn't know how. But there was something in the way he looked at her, something that told her this was no longer the man she had married. There was no us anymore. There was just a fractured shell of what used to be. It was the moment she realized that things had changed irreparably. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew the only way forward was to face it, no matter how painful it would be. She needed answers. Not from Daniel, not from Emily, but from herself. What now? The weight of silence hung in the room like a thick fog. The air was heavy with unspoken tension as Claire stood by Daniel's bedside, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the sheet. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking through the otherwise oppressive stillness. She had been here for hours, staring at him, waiting for some sign of the man she thought she knew. But now, in the wake of everything, it felt as though he was a stranger. He stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open, but there was no recognition in his gaze. It was a disorienting moment, as though he was trying to piece together who he was and where he was. For a moment, Claire thought she might have imagined it, this hollow look in his eyes, the one that said he didn't even know what he had lost. "Daniel," Claire said softly, her voice trembling just a little. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. "Do you remember what happened? Can you tell me anything?" She didn't know what answer she was hoping for, but she couldn't stand the uncertainty. His eyes flickered to her, the confusion in them slowly giving way to a glimmer of recognition. But then, the briefest flicker of guilt. And that was all it took. The air shifted, like a cold gust sweeping through a quiet room, and Claire knew what was coming. "I remember," Daniel said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "I remember everything." There was no avoiding it anymore. The truth had to come out. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking as the weight of what had happened seemed to hit him in waves, Claire, I didn't mean for any of this. You have to know that. His hands reached out, but Claire took a step back, unable to bear the touch she had once craved. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but now it wasn't with love. It was with a fury she could hardly contain. How could you do this to me? Claire's voice was almost a hiss as she looked down at him. How could you betray me like this, Daniel, after everything we've been through? He swallowed hard, the guilt on his face visible, but it only made Claire feel more cold inside. It wasn't just me, Claire, I wasn't the only one, Emily. Don't! Claire interrupted him, her voice rising now, full of pent-up anger and hurt. Don't even say her name, I know what happened. I saw the way you looked at her, the way you… It wasn't just some mistake you planned this. You betrayed me, Daniel. You betrayed us. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stepped back further, her breath quickening. I don't even recognize you anymore. How could you do this to me, to us? Daniel's face twisted in pain as he tried to reach out again, his hand trembling. Claire, please, don't say that I don't know how it happened. It was never supposed to be like this. You have to believe me. It was never meant to hurt you. But it did. It did hurt me, Daniel. It hurt me more than I can ever explain. Claire's words were almost choking her now, the grief and anger crashing through her, unstoppable. I gave everything to you, I trusted you, and you just threw it all away. He didn't respond, just looked up at her with those wide, apologetic eyes, as if waiting for her to forgive him with a flick of her hand, but she couldn't. Not now, not ever. In the deafening silence that followed, Claire felt her resolve harden. There was no going back. She wasn't sure what she would do with herself now, but there was no way she could stay in this room, pretending like things could ever go back to how they were. As she turned and walked out of the room, she could feel Daniel's eyes on her, pleading silently for her to stay, for her to understand, but she didn't. She couldn't. Meanwhile, Emily was sitting in her car outside the hospital, her hands gripped tightly around the steering wheel. She had promised Claire she would stay away, that she would give her space to deal with Daniel. But now that the moment had come, the moment when everything she had done, every mistake she had made, would finally be confronted. Emily felt paralyzed. She had known this day would come, but even the knowledge hadn't prepared her for how it felt to see Claire's face, to witness the raw pain in her eyes. Emily had never imagined herself as a villain in someone else's life. But that was exactly how it felt now. She had been the other woman, the one who had come between them, and there was no undoing it. The truth was out, and Emily was left to face the consequences. Her phone buzzed suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Daniel. I need to see you. Please. She stared at the message, her heart pounding. This was the moment. Everything she had been running from was about to catch up to her. But as she started to type a reply, she saw a figure walk by the car window. It was Claire. She was walking, her face a mask of determination, her steps deliberate. She didn't see Emily, didn't acknowledge her at all. It was almost as if Claire was walking straight into the storm, fully aware of what was coming. Emily felt a sharp pang in her chest, a combination of guilt and fear. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, least of all Claire. But here they were, at the edge of it all, standing on the precipice of something irreparable. And then, Claire stopped. She turned toward Emily's car, their eyes locking through the windshield for a brief suspended moment. Claire didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her gaze was enough. The anger, the betrayal, the grief. It was all there, unspoken but louder than words. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and before she knew it, Claire was gone, disappearing into the distance gone. But the impact of that single moment stayed with her, an unbearable weight. Later that night, After a sleepless, restless evening filled with both physical and emotional exhaustion, Emily finally found herself face to face with Daniel. The tension between them was palpable, and she could feel the chill in the air as she stood across from him. "You need to tell her, Daniel," Emily said, her voice quieter than usual. "You need to be honest with her." He looked at her, almost incredulous. "Honest? You think I haven't been?" "No." She shook her head, a painful truth echoing in her voice. "You've been hiding behind your excuses, your guilt. But you can't keep running from this. Claire deserves to know everything. She deserves the truth." Daniel's face was hard, but Emily could see the cracks forming. This wasn't the man she had known before. This was someone on the edge. Someone who had broken too much to ever put the pieces back together. "I can't," he whispered. "I don't know how to fix this, Emily. I don't know how to make it right." But Emily knew. There was no fixing this. There was only facing the consequences. And that, more than anything else, was the hardest part. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Claire arrived back at the apartment. She stood for a long moment outside the door, her hand resting on the cold metal of the doorknob, the weight of what had transpired hanging heavily on her shoulders. She was exhausted, drained from the confrontation with Daniel, from the emotional toll of everything that had happened. But more than anything, she felt numb. Was this really her life now? The door opened with a soft click, and she stepped inside. The apartment felt different somehow. Quieter, emptier, like the space itself had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling in the wake of everything that had happened. She wasn't sure what she expected, but this wasn't it. The first thing she noticed was the mess, clothes strewn across the floor, half-empty coffee cups on the counter, the chaos of her life and Daniel's suddenly exposed in every corner. It made her want to scream. Her gaze lingered on the couch, where she could almost still see Daniel's outline imprinted in the cushions she'd spent so many nights curled up there with him, talking about their future, about the life they were supposed to build together. How had it all gone so wrong? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of the haze of her thoughts. It was a message from Emily. "I'm sorry, Claire. I never meant for things to get this far. I understand if you can't forgive me. I just wanted you to know the truth." Claire read the message twice before setting the phone down with a quiet sigh. Emily's apology felt almost too little, too late. But Claire wasn't sure what she wanted. Forgiveness, an explanation. What could either of them offer now that everything had been laid bare? She wasn't angry at Emily. Not anymore. She was angry at herself. For not seeing it sooner. For letting things spiral so far out of control. Her phone buzzed again. And this time it was Daniel. "Please, Claire. Let me explain I've made mistakes, but I need you to hear me out." She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. She didn't want to engage. She didn't want to relive the hurt, the betrayal. But part of her, a small part, buried deep down, still wanted answers. She still wanted to understand. With a heavy heart, she hit reply. "I don't know if I can listen right now, I need time." And just like that, the chapter with Daniel was closed. Or at least, it would be. For now. There was no easy way forward, no clear path to reconciliation. But Claire knew she needed space to figure out who she was without him. As the days passed, Claire began to find a strange sense of peace. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't perfect. But little by little she started to reclaim pieces of herself. She began to focus on the things she had neglected. The friends she hadn't spoken to in months. The hobbies she'd put on hold for a relationship that, in the end, wasn't what she thought it was. One afternoon, Claire sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a journal, the soft glow of the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. She hadn't written in months, not since before all of this started. And as she put pen to paper, The words came easily, almost like a release. It was as though each stroke of the pen peeled away another layer of the emotional armor she'd built around herself. It was hard to explain how it felt, like learning to breathe again after holding your breath for too long. But she could feel herself slowly coming back to life. And for the first time in a long while, it felt okay to be alone. Meanwhile, Emily had made her own decision. After her conversation with Daniel, where she finally admitted that they couldn't go on like this anymore, she knew it was time to make a change. She had to walk away from the mess they had created, but that didn't make it any easier. She found herself sitting in her apartment, her hands wrapped around a glass of wine as she thought about everything that had happened. Her relationship with Daniel was over, she knew that for sure now, but the weight of guilt still pressed down on her. She had lost her best friend, Claire, and there was no getting her back. At least, not right now. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Emily knew it was what needed to happen. She had to take responsibility for her actions and stop running from the consequences. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily took a deep breath and sent one final message to Claire. "I hope you can find peace, Claire. I truly wish you all the best. I'll be here if you ever want to talk." It was a simple message, but it carried with it a weight of finality. Emily couldn't undo what had happened. She couldn't erase the hurt she had caused, but she could try to be a better person going forward. She could learn from her mistakes. The final moments of the story come full circle when Claire and Emily meet, not as enemies, not as victims of the same betrayal, but as two women who have grown, who have learned from their pain. It's not a grand gesture, not a dramatic confrontation, but something quieter, something more real. Claire is walking through a park on a crisp autumn afternoon when she sees Emily sitting on a bench, looking out over the pond. There's no hostility between them now, just a silent understanding. Claire hesitates for a moment, then walks over, sitting down beside her. They don't need to say anything at first. The silence is enough. Finally, Claire speaks, her voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry," she says, her gaze focused on the pond in front of them. I think I'm finally starting to forgive myself." Emily nods slowly, her eyes moistening with unspoken emotion. "Me too," she whispers, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know what comes next, but I'm trying to move forward." The two of them sit in silence, watching the sunset together. It's not a perfect resolution, but it's the beginning of something new, a sense of closure. The pain is still there, but so is the possibility of healing. In the end, they don't need to fix everything. Sometimes, just being there for one another is enough. And so, the story concludes, Claire and Emily, each on their own path, continue to grow, to learn, and to find strength in the aftermath of their mistakes. Daniel's chapter is closed for now, and while there are no guarantees about what the future holds, there is hope. For the first time in a long while, they all have the chance to start over. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. I'll be back soon with another deep dive into a story you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.